A staff in a man's hand becomes an actual serpent and devours the other serpents whole. Entire families are consumed alive as the earth splits beneath them. Deadly snake bites are cured instantly just by looking at bronze serpents, and a donkey speaks in full sentences to its master about an angel wielding a sword that only the animal can see. If you believe the book of Numbers is nothing more than a dull record of population counts, you would be completely mistaken. This book stands as one of the most supernatural, dramatic, and action-filled texts in all of Scripture, and I'm going to demonstrate this to you by examining every incredible story it contains from start to finish. Before we begin, though, please take just a moment to like this video and subscribe if you're not already a subscriber. I always love hearing from you. Go ahead and introduce yourself, tell us your location, and share what time it is where you are. This really helps us appreciate the worldwide community that we truly represent. So with that said, let's get started, shall we? Reconsidering the fourth book. Turn in your Bible to the fourth book. You'll find it labeled Numbers. The name gives the impression of some ancient accounting ledger, something completely devoid of life and interest. Teachers in Sunday school often pass right over it. Ministers pull isolated narratives from it, but almost never teach through the entire book. The title alone has caused harm, giving people the idea that they're looking at spreadsheets when they're actually holding something far more ominous and compelling. The Hebrew tradition names this book Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness. That title reveals everything you need to know. This isn't a story about tallying populations. It's a story about wandering through desolate places. It's about an entire generation that arrived at the threshold of everything they'd been promised and selected the void instead. The population counts frame the narrative like bookends surrounding a catastrophe of national proportions, measuring not simply how many people there were, but the magnitude of what was lost. Imagine a tragedy in 3 acts playing out in the desert. The first act presents a nation at its highest point, structured and sanctified, prepared to walk into their destiny. The second act records the disintegration, one uprising after another, the complete breakdown of trust between a people and the one who rescued them. The third act shows a kind of purgatory, 4 decades of waiting while a generation under condemnation slowly fades away so their descendants can make another attempt. Standing between these acts are 2 military population counts, separated by close to 40 years. That first census tallies 600,000 men of fighting age, not counting women and children, representing a tremendous multitude fresh out of Egyptian bondage, arranged by tribes and camps, ready for warfare. The second census, conducted at the very location where the book concludes, counts an entirely new generation. Nearly every single person from that first count has perished. 2 individuals made it through that interval, Joshua and Caleb, the only scouts who actually believed what God promised. This describes the structure of the book. You observe an entire generation receiving absolutely everything: freedom from slavery, divine law, the manifest presence of God, and they discard it all because of fear masquerading as wisdom. The tragedy cuts deeper because their failure appears so logical. Who wouldn't feel afraid facing fortified strongholds and warrior giants? Who wouldn't long for familiar meals after endless months of eating manna? Those who rebel in numbers aren't cartoon villains. They raise objections that almost make sense, until you understand they're essentially calling God dishonest. The wilderness becomes the setting for this drama, not some symbolic wilderness, but the actual Sinai Peninsula, the Negev Desert, and territories on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Genuine geography, genuine heat, genuine desperation for water. The Israelites traveled through the same barren landscapes where Bedouin tribes would struggle to survive for thousands of years afterward. The location itself functions as character, instructor, and executioner all at once. What distinguishes this tragedy from Greek theatrical drama or the downfalls in Shakespeare is the theological layer. The people don't suffer because of fate or misfortune. They suffer because of decisions they make. God extends an offer of land. They turn it down. God pronounces a sentence of wandering. They attempt invasion regardless, and are defeated. The cycle keeps repeating. Divine offer, human rejection, consequence, frantic attempt to undo the consequence, failure. The book trains you to understand freedom and slavery not as external circumstances, but as attitudes of trust or attitudes of fear. Numbers also denies you the ease of identifying clear villains. Moses himself experiences failure. Aaron takes part in challenges directed at his brother. Miriam speaks out against the appointed leader. The people aren't evil. They're exhausted, terrified refugees who want water and food and some reasonable guarantee they won't all perish. Their grievances sound like things you yourself would voice after months of nomadic suffering. The text refuses to let you create distance. You're implicated in what they do wrong because you recognize their fears as identical to your own. The structure itself communicates meaning. The book begins with careful order, population count, arrangement of the camp, tribal positioning, duties assigned to Levites. Everything organized. Everyone given a designated place. By the middle portion, disorder breaks out. Disease, earthquakes, poisonous snakes. The closing section presents painful rebuilding. A second census, fresh laws, preparations for crossing over. But the leader who guided them this far will not be allowed to cross. The cost of the wilderness years includes Moses himself, placed in an unmarked burial site on the eastern side of the river. Contemporary readers frequently approach Numbers as a collection of moral teachings or verses for quoting. We pull out the bronze serpent, the speaking donkey, the staff that bloomed, and file them under illustrations. This method completely misses the accumulated impact. The book wants you to experience the duration, the relentless repetition of desert existence, the soul-destroying awareness that your parents' generation chose death, and you're living in the wake of that choice. The census numbers themselves communicate the story. The first count reveals a mighty assembly. The second reveals modest decline in certain tribes, expansion in others. But the crushing reality is that virtually no one counted in chapter 1 shows up in chapter 26. An entire generation vanished during the time between these lists. The numbers aren't just counting. They're memorials for the dead. This book stands as the turning point between liberation and possession. Exodus brings you out. Leviticus makes you consecrated. Numbers poses the question of whether you trust enough to go in. Deuteronomy recaps the entire narrative from Moses' viewpoint, but Numbers gives you the unfiltered experience, the scorching heat, the grievances, the failures, the long, hollow years, when nothing appears to be happening except people aging and dying in tents. You're about to step into a narrative that covers 4 decades, multiple generations, and the complete theological question of whether human beings can maintain trust in a God they cannot see when everything around them seems to argue against him. The book qualifies as tragedy, because none of this had to happen this way. The land had been promised, the people stood ready, all the pieces were in position, and they said no. Act 1. Sinai's shadow, structure, and rising expectations. The book begins on the first day of the 2nd month of the 2nd year following the departure from Egypt. Count backward from there. The Exodus occurred. The law was delivered. The tabernacle was constructed and raised. Now, approximately 13 months after leaving Pharaoh behind, the people stand positioned at Sinai, organized and prepared to move forward. God instructs Moses to conduct a census. This isn't bureaucracy for the sake of having records. In the ancient Near East, censuses fulfilled military and administrative functions. You count to determine how many warriors you can deploy, how much food you'll need to supply, how to structure marching formation and camp configuration. The census assesses capacity for conquest. The counting proceeds one tribe at a time. Reuben, Simeon, Gad, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Ephraim, Manasseh, Benjamin, Dan, Asher, Naphtali. Levi receives a separate count. Their function differs from the other tribes. The totals are enormous: 600, 3,000, 550 fighting men. Include women, children, and elderly, and you're examining a population exceeding 2 million individuals. Scholars argue about these numbers. Some interpret them at face value. Others propose scribal mistakes, or suggest the Hebrew term translated as thousand might indicate something different: clan, unit, or military division. The debate carries less weight than the narrative purpose. The text wants you to grasp that this represents a substantial force, not some ragged collection of refugees. They've expanded from 70 individuals entering Egypt centuries before to a nation capable of confronting Canaanite city-states. Following the count comes the arrangement. God provides Moses with detailed instructions for organizing the camp. The tabernacle occupies the center position. Directly surrounding it, the Levites establish camp. Kohathites positioned south, Gershonites positioned west, Merarites positioned north. Moses, Aaron, and Aaron's sons camp on the eastern side, protecting the entrance. Beyond the Levites, the 12 tribes position themselves in 4 clusters of 3 tribes each, one cluster facing each cardinal direction. The eastern camp contains Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. Judah takes the lead, positioned symbolically facing the tabernacle entrance. The southern camp contains Reuben, Simeon, and Gad. The western camp holds Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin, all descendants of Joseph. The northern camp contains Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. Each tribal grouping has an appointed leader, specific population numbers, and assigned location. This configuration creates an enormous square or rectangle with the tabernacle positioned at the exact center. When they travel, the sequence carries significance. Judah's camp takes the lead. The tabernacle and those carrying it follow next, surrounded by Levites. The other tribes form the rear guard and flanks. Picture this: a mobile city organized around sacred space, moving through wilderness like a living representation of cosmic structure. The Levites receive particular attention. Unlike other tribes counted for military service, Levites are designated for sanctuary duties. The firstborn male of every Israelite household technically belongs to God, set apart after the Passover when God preserved Hebrew firstborn children in Egypt. But rather than claiming the eldest son from every family, God accepts the Levite tribe as replacement. The Levites become living substitutes, occupying the place where all Israel's firstborn would otherwise be required to serve. Each Levitical clan receives distinct responsibilities. The Kohathites transport the holy objects: the ark, the table, the lampstand, the altars. But they are prohibited from touching these items directly, or death will result. Aaron's sons must cover everything before the Kohathites come near. The Gershonites carry the tent fabric, curtains, and screens. The Merarites transport the structural components: frames, posts, bases, and pegs. 3 clans, 1 tabernacle, every component inventoried and assigned. Beyond Levitical structure, The text addresses maintaining purity in the camp. Anyone suffering from infectious skin conditions, bodily discharge, or contamination from corpses must temporarily reside outside the camp. This isn't random prejudice. The camp itself is holy because God resides at its center. Impurity doesn't equal sin, but it's incompatible with closeness to divine presence. The regulations safeguard both the individual and the community. This section also contains laws regarding restitution, trials for jealousy, accusations, and Nazirite vows. These appear scattered until you recognize they all concern holiness within community life. Restitution laws guarantee justice. The jealousy trial offers judicial procedure for accusations that could otherwise tear families apart. The Nazirite vow permits individuals to dedicate themselves temporarily to God through abstaining from wine, refraining from cutting hair, and avoiding dead bodies. Samson and Samuel would later become lifetime Nazirites, but here the vow is typically temporary, allowing ordinary people to intensify their devotion. Then arrives the dedication ceremony for the tabernacle. Each tribal leader presents identical offerings across 12 days. 1 silver plate weighing 130 shekels, 1 silver basin of 70 shekels, both filled with grain offering, 1 gold dish of 10 shekels filled with incense, 1 bull, 1 ram, 1 lamb for burnt offering, 1 goat for purification offering, 2 oxen, 5 rams, 5 male goats, 5 lambs for fellowship offering. 12 days, 12 matching gifts. The repetition feels monotonous when reading, but imagine the actual ceremony, day following day, tribe following tribe, each bringing the same gift, demonstrating unity and equality before God. The Levites experience their own consecration ritual. They're shaved completely, washed thoroughly, and presented as a wave offering before the Lord, meaning they're symbolically lifted or waved, designating them for divine service. The ceremony separates them from the other tribes, marking their new identity as those who maintain the sacred. Throughout these chapters, hope dominates. The people are organized, consecrated, equipped, and prepared. They've received the law at Sinai. They've constructed the tabernacle. They've witnessed God's glory descend upon it. The difficult work appears complete. Ahead lies an 11-day journey to Canaan, battles they're equipped to win, and entry into territory promised to their ancestors centuries ago. The text offers no indication yet of approaching disaster. Everything points toward success. The nation that departed Egypt as slaves now operates as a holy army with God positioned at its center. They possess leadership, structure, law, and presence. What could possibly go wrong? The mobile sacred city. The camp as a small-scale model of the universe. The Israelite camp wasn't arranged randomly. Every detail encoded significance, establishing a portable sacred geography that represented cosmic structure in motion. At the center stood the tabernacle, not merely a religious structure, but the appointed meeting location between heaven and earth, the localized presence of the God who created everything. The structure itself displayed deliberate symbolism. The innermost chamber, the Holy of Holies, housed the ark with its mercy seat, the actual throne of God. 1 chamber outward, the holy place contained the lampstand, the table of bread, and the incense altar, all symbolizing aspects of creation sustained by divine order. The outer courtyard held the bronze altar for sacrifices and the bronze basin for priestly cleansing. As you moved from the outside toward the center, space became increasingly holy. Ordinary people entered only the courtyard. Priests could enter the holy place on a daily basis. The high priest alone entered the Holy of Holies once each year on the Day of Atonement. Closeness to the center demanded increasing holiness. Encircling the tabernacle, the Levites established a protective zone. Their position wasn't accidental. They stood between the holy objects and the tribes, protecting both. If an unauthorized individual approached the tabernacle, the Levites stopped them. If holiness radiated outward dangerously, the Levites absorbed it. They mediated between sacred space and common space. Beyond the Levites, the 12 tribes positioned themselves in quadrants. This established concentric rectangles. Tabernacle at center, Levites encircling it, tribes forming the outer perimeter. The entire camp became a visual representation of holiness, with gradations of sanctity radiating outward from the divine presence at the hub. The 4 tribal camps aligned with the cardinal directions, implying cosmic scope. In ancient Near Eastern thinking, 4 directions symbolized completeness, the entire earth. By positioning tribes this way, the camp symbolically included all creation. They didn't merely represent Israel. They modeled redeemed humanity, organized around divine presence. Each tribe's position also communicated symbolic significance. Judah camped east, directly before the tabernacle entrance, the position of honor. Judah would ultimately produce kings, and, according to later tradition, the Messiah. Reuben, the firstborn who forfeited his birthright through sin, camped south, significant but not primary. Ephraim, Joseph's younger son who received the superior blessing, led the western camp. Dan occupied the rear position, north, a location that later tradition connected with judgment and threat. When the camp mobilized, Judah broke camp first, leading the march. Then the tabernacle was taken down. Gershonites and Merarites transported structural components forward. Reuben's camp followed next. After them came the Kohathites, carrying the holy objects, timed so the framework could be rebuilt before the most sacred items arrived. Ephraim's camp followed, then Dan, collecting stragglers and functioning as rear guard. This mobile city extended for miles when stationary. 2 million people distributed across the desert, organized into tribes and clans, everyone aware of their assigned location. Ancient sources indicate the camp might have stretched several miles in every direction. When marching, the column would extend for miles, a river of humanity flowing through wilderness. The camp also operated as spiritual education. Every morning you awakened and observed the tabernacle at the center, God's presence visible as cloud during day and fire during night. Your location relative to that center determined your identity. You weren't simply an individual. You were a member of a particular tribe with a particular position in relation to holiness. The configuration taught continual awareness of God's centrality. The purity regulations reinforced this spatial theology. Impurity necessitated temporary removal outside the camp. You departed the ordered holy community and resided beyond its boundaries until purified. Then you re-entered. The dividing line between inside and outside the camp became the dividing line between purity and impurity, order and disorder, life with God and separation from Him. The camp reflected creation itself. In Genesis, God brings order from disorder through separation, light from darkness, water from land, day from night. The camp accomplished the same thing, carved ordered holy space from the shapeless wilderness. As long as the structure remained intact, as long as everyone maintained their position and purity, the camp stood as a small victory of divine order over chaotic nature. This makes the approaching rebellions more catastrophic. When people question the arrangement, asking why Levites alone serve the tabernacle, why Moses and Aaron exclusively lead, why they cannot approach God directly themselves, they're not simply complaining about leadership structures. They're threatening to demolish the careful organization that makes divine presence among them possible. Rebellion becomes cosmic danger. The camp also foreshadowed the ultimate objective, Canaan itself. Once established in the land, the tribes would spread across territories, but the tabernacle would stay central, eventually positioned in Shiloh, later in Jerusalem. The portable structure would become fixed. The temporary configuration modeled the future condition. For the present, though, they live in tents. The entire city assembles and breaks down at divine instruction. Nothing remains permanent except the presence at the center. The tabernacle can be packed, transported, and erected elsewhere. God travels with them, and they organize themselves around him wherever he directs. This spatial theology explains ancient Israel's horror when the tabernacle or later temple suffered violation or destruction. These weren't simply religious buildings. They were the structural center of reality, the location where heaven contacted earth. Attack them, and you attack cosmic order itself. The camp embodied a vision, humanity properly organized around divine presence, every person aware of their place, holiness radiating from center to circumference. For this moment at Sinai, the vision held. The camp stood as designed, perfect order beneath the mountain where God delivered the law, the cloud and fire, the unsettling guidance of God. On the day the tabernacle was raised, cloud covered it. From evening until morning, the cloud took on the appearance of fire. This pattern continued without break. Cloud during day, fire during night, visible to the entire encampment. The pillar remained over the tabernacle, indicating God's presence among them. The cloud directed their movement. When it lifted from the tabernacle, the Israelites broke camp. When it settled down, they established camp. Sometimes the cloud remained 2 days, sometimes a month, sometimes a year. However long it stayed, they stayed. When it lifted, they traveled. This sounds like blessing, direct divine direction, no uncertainty, no arguments. But consider the psychological burden. You cannot make plans. You cannot say, we'll remain here 2 weeks while the livestock graze and we repair tools. You might awaken tomorrow and observe the cloud lifting, demanding immediate departure, or you might plan to depart soon and discover the cloud has settled for months. The cloud required absolute trust and constant preparedness. You learn to live with bags packed, so to speak. Your existence became an exercise in yielding control. Human independence submitted to divine sovereignty. You moved when he commanded movement, halted when he commanded stopping, and you never knew beforehand which it would be. The visible presence also meant responsibility. You couldn't pretend God was remote or theoretical. The pillar stood before everyone daily. When you grumbled in view of the fire. When you committed sin, you sinned beneath the cloud. The presence that guided also observed. Privilege arrived with examination. The dual character of the pillar, cloud and fire, captures something fundamental about God's nature in this narrative. Cloud implies covering, protection, shade from desert heat, blessing. Fire implies danger, holiness that destroys, the presence you cannot approach carelessly. Both remain true at the same time. The same presence that protects also threatens. You're secure as long as you maintain proper relationship to it. But violate that relationship, and the fire can turn against you. The wilderness setting amplified this dynamic. In comfortable conditions, delayed guidance feels like patience. In desert, delay means exhausting provisions, using up grazing areas, wondering whether you'll survive. When the cloud lingered, faith faced testing. Does he realize we're running low on water? Has he abandoned us? When it lifted abruptly after extended stillness, you scrambled to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people. The pillar also blocked independence. They couldn't send scouts ahead and select their route. They couldn't dispatch messengers to negotiate passage through nations in advance. They traveled at divine pace, on divine timetable, to divine destinations. This complete dependence cultivated trust under ideal conditions. In reality, it generated resentment. Adults desire agency. Refugees particularly crave control after enduring the helplessness of slavery. The cloud's timing appears sometimes almost instructional, designed to teach rather than merely direct. Remain in one location long enough to get comfortable, then relocate. Travel rapidly through several locations, then stop unexpectedly in an unwelcoming spot for months. The pattern breaks you of the delusion that you govern your existence. You learn viscerally that God's schedule doesn't align with human preference. Later, when rebellions erupt, the people's complaints gain context. They've existed under this system for months. No independence, no planning, complete dependence. The arrangement works if you trust God's goodness. Question that goodness, and the same arrangement feels like control or oppression. The mechanics don't change, your interpretation of them does. The pillar also prevented them from returning to Egypt, even if they desired to, at least not easily. The cloud didn't direct backward. It directed forward through wilderness, circling toward Canaan from the south. To return to Egypt meant abandoning the pillar, setting out independently, navigating desert without divine direction. The very instrument of blessing became a form of restriction. At night, the fire supplied illumination. In pre-modern circumstances, darkness was absolute. No street lighting, no ambient glow. The fire above the tabernacle meant the camp never descended into complete blackness. You could always find your bearings by the glow. You knew where the center was. The fire operated as beacon directing not simply the march, but daily life. Yet fire also disturbed sleep. Some nights you'd observe the pillar blazing and recall stories of Sinai, how the mountain burned, how God descended in fire and smoke, how people pleaded with Moses to mediate because they couldn't endure direct encounter. The same fire that comforted also reminded you that the God in your midst could annihilate you instantly if holiness and sin collided. The mechanics of following the cloud required communication structures. Trumpets signaled gathering and movement commands. When the cloud lifted, trumpets sounded, different patterns for breaking camp versus general assembly. The sound traveled across the sprawling encampment, transmitting divine command through human instruments. The system merged transcendent guidance with practical organization. Moses describes the routine. Whether it was 2 days, a month, or a year that the cloud remained over the tabernacle, the Israelites camped and did not travel, but when it lifted, they traveled. The verse communicates repetitive obedience. Day following day, week following week, observing the cloud, waiting, responding. This was their existence, watching the sky, packed and prepared, trusting that movement meant guidance toward the objective, even when the route appeared incorrect. The cloud also unified them. Wealthy and poor, Judah and Dan, Levite and ordinary person, everyone followed the same signal. No one received advance information, no one negotiated a different route. The pillar was democratically authoritarian. It commanded everyone equally, blessed everyone equally, and provided everyone the same information simultaneously. In this sense, the cloud enforced community. Yet the approaching rebellion demonstrates that observing the same sign doesn't guarantee identical faith. Two people can watch the cloud and interpret differently. One perceives provision, guidance, presence. Another perceives arbitrary control, confusing delays, questionable routes. The pillar guided, but it didn't force belief. You still had to decide whether to trust the one guiding or resent the absence of explanation. Act 2. The rebellion cycle begins, from craving to contempt. The cloud lifted, trumpets sounded. After nearly a year at Sinai, the march toward Canaan commenced. The tribes set out in sequence, Judah leading, tabernacle following, remaining camps forming the rear. Everything proceeded as instructed. 11 days' journey to the border, then conquest. The atmosphere should have been victorious. 3 days into the march, the people complained. The text doesn't identify the specific complaint, just states the people expressed grievances about difficulty. Fire erupted at the edges of the camp, consuming some of the outermost tents. Moses interceded. The fire ceased. They named the location Taberah, burning marking the first fracture in unity. The second complaint followed immediately. The rabble among them, possibly the mixed crowd of non-Israelites who departed Egypt with them, began craving meat. The craving spread. Soon the Israelites joined in. Who will provide us meat? We recall the fish we consumed in Egypt at no cost, the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. Now our appetite has vanished. There's nothing except this manna. The complaint exposes deep dysfunction. They romanticize slavery as free fish and pleasant vegetables, conveniently erasing the forced labor, murdered children, and brutal oppression. Manna, bread from heaven that sustained them daily, becomes this manna, spoken with disdain. Provision becomes imprisonment. Gift becomes complaint. God's anger ignites. Moses, caught between God's fury and the people's contempt, collapses. He prays desperately, "Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? Why have I not found favor with you that you burden me with all these people? Did I conceive them? Did I give them birth? Why do you tell me to carry them like a nursing child to the land you promised their ancestors? Where can I obtain meat for all these people? They keep crying to me for meat. I can't carry all these people by myself. The burden is unbearable. If this is how you're going to treat me, just kill me now. Don't let me face my own destruction." Moses' prayer startles us. He's approaching resignation, suicidal in his desperation. Leadership has destroyed him. The great deliverer wants escape. God responds not with rebuke, but with assistance. He tells Moses to assemble 70 elders. God will take some of the Spirit resting on Moses and distribute it among them so they can share the burden. As for meat, so much meat they'll become sick of it. You'll consume it until it exits your nostrils, and you despise it because you rejected the Lord who is among you and cried before him, "Why did we ever depart Egypt?" Moses expresses doubt. 600,000 men plus families. Where could sufficient meat come from to feed them for a month? God asks. Is the Lord's arm too limited? You'll observe whether my word proves true. The Spirit distributes among the 70 elders. They prophesy temporarily, apparently ecstatic speech, marking them as Spirit-filled. 2 men, Eldad and Medad, who stayed in camp rather than traveling to the tabernacle, also prophesied. Joshua, concerned about proper procedure, asks Moses to stop them. Moses refuses. Are you jealous for my sake? I wish all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would place his Spirit on them. Then the wind arrives. Quail blow in from the sea, falling exhausted around the camp, piled 3 feet deep for miles in every direction. The people gather frantically. Some collect 10 homers, approximately 60 bushels. They spread quail around the camp to dry and preserve. While the meat remains between their teeth, before they finish chewing, plague strikes. Many perish, buried at Kibroth-Hattaavah, graves of craving. The pattern establishes itself. Complaint, divine provision mixed with judgment, death. The second rebellion cycle begins at Hazeroth. Miriam and Aaron speak against Moses, questioning his unique authority. Has the Lord spoken exclusively through Moses? Hasn't he also spoken through us? The text notes their grievance involved Moses' Cushite wife, perhaps Zipporah, or possibly a second wife from Cush, modern Ethiopia or Sudan. God summons all three to the tabernacle. He descends in the pillar, stands at the entrance, and calls Aaron and Miriam forward. Then he speaks, "Hear my words. When prophets of the Lord arise, I reveal myself in visions and speak in dreams. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. I speak with him face to face, clearly, not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. Why weren't you afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" God's anger burns against them. The cloud lifts. Miriam stands leprous, her skin like snow, the text states, meaning diseased, flaking, white with infection. Aaron, observing her, pleads with Moses, "Please, my Lord, don't hold this sin against us which we committed so foolishly. Don't let her be like a stillborn infant, whose flesh is half-eaten when it emerges from the womb." Moses cries to God, "Please, God, heal her." God responds that she must bear shame for 7 days. If her father had spit in her face, she'd be excluded 7 days. So let her be confined outside the camp 7 days. Miriam is removed. The camp waits. After 7 days, she returns healed. They march to the wilderness of Paran. 3 rebellions in rapid succession. First, vague complaints about hardship. Second, craving for meat, romanticizing slavery. Third, challenge to Moses' authority from his own siblings. Each escalates. Each brings divine response. Fire, plague, disease. The honeymoon period has ended. The cracks widen. What's remarkable is the velocity. Days into the march, unity shatters. The people who stood at Sinai, who constructed the tabernacle and witnessed its dedication, who marched out organized and prepared, they unravel almost instantly. The organized camp transforms into a complaining crowd. The holy nation reveals itself as fragile alliance held together only by visible miracle. And even visible miracle proves insufficient. Moses' emotional condition deteriorates. He transitions from confident leader to suicidal intercessor to exhausted mediator between God's wrath and the people's rebellion. The cost of leadership becomes unbearable. Even Miriam, the prophetess who led women in celebration at the sea, descends into jealousy and questions her brother's unique calling. The wilderness itself intensifies every tension. In Egypt they experienced slavery, but also stability, predictable oppression, familiar food, permanent shelter. In the wilderness, everything remains unstable. Food appears daily, but you cannot accumulate it. Water arrives miraculously, but not always when you desire it. The cloud guides, but doesn't provide explanations. They're perpetually dependent, perpetually uncertain, perpetually unable to control their circumstances. This dependence, intended to build trust, instead cultivates resentment. They interpret reliance as vulnerability. They view provision as inadequate. They remember oppression as security. The psychological dynamics of traumatized people emerge. Better the devil you recognize than the uncertainty of freedom. Better slavery's predictability than promise that demands faith. The rebellions also expose social dynamics. The rabble influences the Israelites. Craving spreads like disease. One person's discontent becomes communal crisis. Leaders themselves aren't protected. Miriam and Aaron, closest to Moses, challenge him publicly. If his siblings question his unique calling, how can the masses trust him? The stage is prepared for catastrophe. 3 rebellions have occurred in quick succession. Divine judgment has fallen 3 times. Moses is exhausted. The people are embittered. They're approaching the border of Canaan, where spies will examine the land. The next rebellion won't concern food or authority. It'll concern whether to enter the promise at all. The spies report the psychology of a panicked majority. They arrived at Kadesh on Canaan's southern border. The land promised to Abraham centuries ago lay ahead. God instructed Moses, "Send men to examine the land I'm giving the Israelites. Send 1 leader from each ancestral tribe." 12 men departed: Shammua from Reuben, Shaphat from Simeon, Caleb from Judah, Egal from Issachar, Hoshea, whom Moses renamed Joshua, from Ephraim, Palti from Benjamin, Gadiel from Zebulun, Gadi from Manasseh, Amiel from Dan, Sether from Asher, Nabi from Naphtali, Geuel from Gad. All leaders, all selected specifically for this assignment. Moses instructed them, "Scout the land. Observe what it's like, whether the people are strong or weak, few or numerous. Examine the towns. Are they fortified? Is the soil productive? Bring back fruit as proof." 40 days they scouted, traveling from the wilderness of Zin in the south through the Negev into the hill country as far north as Rehob near Lebo Hamath. They reached the valley of Eshcol and cut a cluster of grapes so enormous it required 2 men to carry it on a pole, along with pomegranates and figs. The land's productivity was undeniable. It literally flowed with abundance. They returned to Kadesh and presented their findings. The initial report was factual. "We entered the land where you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here's its fruit." Then the devastating turn. "However, the people living there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and extremely large. We even observe descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites occupy the Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites occupy the hill country, and the Canaanites occupy the coastal areas and along the Jordan." Caleb interrupted, quieting the people before Moses. "We should advance at once and take possession of it, because we can certainly conquer it." But the other scouts contradicted him. "We cannot attack those people. They're stronger than we are." They began circulating negative reports. "The land devours its inhabitants. All the people we observed are of enormous size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We appeared like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we must have appeared the same to them." The entire community erupted into weeping that night. People wept until morning. Then the complaints turned accusatory, aimed at Moses and Aaron. "If only we had died in Egypt, or even here in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to die by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be superior for us to return to Egypt?" They said to each other, "Let's select a leader and return to Egypt." Moses and Aaron fell face down before the whole assembly. Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes, a sign of grief and horror, and addressed the community. "The land we passed through and examined is an exceptionally good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, He'll bring us into this land and give it to us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Only don't rebel against the Lord, and don't fear the people of the land. We'll devour them. Their protection has been removed, and the Lord is with us. Don't fear them." The assembly responded by threatening to stone Joshua and Caleb. At that moment, The Lord's glory appeared at the tabernacle before all the Israelites. That phrase reveals everything. We appeared like grasshoppers in our own eyes. They measured themselves against the giants and found themselves tiny. They forgot to factor in the God who drowned Pharaoh's army, split the sea, rained bread from heaven, led them by fire and cloud. They calculated based on human resources alone. The minority, Caleb and Joshua, observed the same obstacles but framed them differently. Their protection has been removed. They perceived the Canaanites as already defeated, awaiting divine judgment through Israelite conquest. The obstacles remained real, but divine promise made them irrelevant. The Lord is with us negated every military advantage the enemy possessed. The majority report spread panic, because fear is infectious. Once 10 authoritative voices declared conquest impossible, the crowd accepted it as truth. The people didn't investigate independently. They didn't pray or seek divine direction. They heard bad news from leaders they trusted and spiraled into despair. The despair rapidly mutated into accusation against God. Why is the Lord bringing us here to die by the sword? They reframed divine promise as divine betrayal. God wasn't leading them to inheritance. He was leading them to slaughter. Their wives and children, the very people God promised to establish in the land, would become plunder for giants. This accusation inverted reality. God had promised Abraham this land 4 centuries earlier. God delivered them from Egypt. God sustained them in wilderness. God gave them His presence, His law, His covenant. Now, at the threshold of fulfillment, they accused Him of malice. The proposal to return to Egypt completed the rebellion. They didn't just refuse to enter Canaan. They actively selected slavery over promise. Let's select a leader and return. This was mutiny, rejecting Moses' leadership and by extension rejecting the God who appointed him. They'd come full circle, from crying out for deliverance in Egypt to preferring Egypt over freedom. The psychology underneath is fear disguised as pragmatism. The spies framed their report in reasonable language. Fortified cities, powerful people, strategic concerns. This wasn't irrational panic, it was sober military assessment, they claimed. But beneath the reasonable surface lay terror and faithlessness. They trusted their eyes over God's word. The threat to stone Caleb and Joshua reveals mob mentality. The 2 men who believed the promise became targets. Rather than consider their arguments, the crowd wanted them silenced permanently. Dissent from the consensus provoked violence. The majority, having decided conquest was impossible, couldn't tolerate voices saying otherwise. The text emphasizes corporate decision-making. This wasn't a few troublemakers stirring problems. The whole community wept, complained, and plotted return. This was national choice. 600,000 men plus families collectively deciding to reject the promise. The scale of the refusal magnified the tragedy. What makes the scene more painful is timing. They stood at the border. 40 days of scouting proved the land's goodness. The grapes from Eshcol testified to abundance. They'd come so far. Sinai, tabernacle, law, covenant, organization, everything pointed toward entry. At the final moment, they said no. The minority tried desperately to reverse the tide. Joshua and Caleb didn't just argue. They tore their clothes in anguish, used emphatic language. Exceptionally good land, don't fear. The Lord is with us. They staked their lives on the promise. The crowd prepared to stone them for it. Divine glory appearing at the tabernacle interrupted the stoning. God had heard sufficient. The people's rebellion, framed as reasonable caution, was about to meet judgment, and Moses would once again stand between divine wrath and national annihilation. The divine sentence. A generation condemned to wander. God spoke to Moses, "How long will these people despise me? How long will they refuse to trust me, despite all the signs I've performed among them? I'll strike them with plague, destroy them, and make you into a nation greater and mightier than they are." Moses interceded immediately, arguing not from the people's merit he had none to cite, but from God's reputation. The Egyptians will hear about this. You brought this people from among them by your power. They've told the inhabitants of this land. They've heard you are among this people, that you appear face to face. Your cloud stands over them. You travel before them in a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. If you eliminate these people, the nations who've heard of your reputation will say, "The Lord wasn't able to bring this people into the land he swore to give them, so he eliminated them in the wilderness." Moses then reminded God of his own self-description from Sinai. The Lord is slow to anger and abounding in faithful love, forgiving iniquity and rebellion. Yet he will not leave the guilty unpunished, bringing the consequences of the father's iniquity on the children to the third and fourth generation. Then Moses prayed, "Please pardon the iniquity of this people in keeping with the greatness of your faithful love, just as you've forgiven them from Egypt until now." God answered, "I have pardoned them as you requested. Yet as surely as I live, and as the whole earth is filled with the Lord's glory, none of the men who saw my glory, and the signs I performed in Egypt and the wilderness, yet tested me these 10 times, and did not obey me, will ever see the land I swore to give their fathers. None of those who despise me will see it. But my servant Caleb has a different spirit, and has followed me completely. I'll bring him into the land where he traveled, and his descendants will possess it. Since the Amalekites and Canaanites are living in the lowlands, turn back tomorrow, and head for the wilderness in the direction of the Sea of Reeds." Then God laid out the specific sentence, "How long will this wicked community complain about me? I have heard the complaints the Israelites make against me. Tell them, as surely as I live, this is the Lord's declaration. I will do to you precisely as I heard you say. Your corpses will fall in this wilderness. All of you who were registered in the census, the entire number of you 20 years old or more, because you have complained about me, I swear that none of you will enter the land I promised to settle you in, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. I'll bring your children, whom you said would become plunder, into the land you rejected, and they will enjoy it. But as for you, your corpses will fall in this wilderness. Your children will be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years, and bear the penalty for your acts of unfaithfulness, until all your corpses lie scattered in the wilderness. You will bear the consequences of your iniquities 40 years, based on the number of the 40 days that you examine the land, a year for each day. You'll understand what it means to have me against you." The sentence was exact. The generation that departed Egypt, every one 20 and older at the time of the census, would perish in the wilderness over 40 years, 1 year for each day the spies scouted. Only Caleb and Joshua would survive to enter. The children they claimed would become plunder would inherit instead. The adults who refused the promise would wander until the last of them fell. God continued, "I, the Lord, have spoken. I swear that I will do this to the entire wicked community that has conspired against me. They will come to an end in the wilderness, and there they will perish." The 10 spies who brought the bad report died immediately, struck down by plague before the Lord. Only Joshua and Caleb survived of the 12 scouts. Moses reported God's words to the Israelites. The people mourned bitterly. Early the next morning they advanced toward the ridge of the hill country, saying, "Let's proceed to the place the Lord promised, for we have sinned." Moses warned them, Why are you going against the Lord's command? It won't succeed. Don't proceed because the Lord is not among you. Don't let yourselves be struck down by your enemies. The Amalekites and Canaanites will confront you there, and you'll fall by the sword. Because you turn from following the Lord, He won't be with you. They proceeded anyway, presuming to march into the hill country, though neither Moses nor the ark moved from the camp. The Amalekites and Canaanites who lived in that region descended, struck them, and routed them as far as Hormah. The judgment contained terrible logic. The people said, "If only we died in the wilderness." God responded, "Your wish is granted." They claimed their children would become plunder. God said, "Your children will inherit. You will perish." They accused him of bringing them to the wilderness to die. He made it so, but as consequence of their choice, not his original intent. The sentence matched the sin. They refused to trust God for 40 days, the spies' mission duration. They'd wander 40 years, 1 year per day. They complained they'd rather die in wilderness than enter Canaan. They die in wilderness, never seeing Canaan. They said their children would be victims. Their children would be victors instead. Every accusation they made against God was transformed into their actual fate, not because God was cruel, but because he took their expressed preference seriously. The death of the 10 spies served as preview. They corrupted the people's faith and died instantly. The rest would take 4 decades to perish, but the process commenced immediately. From this point forward, the narrative marks time by funerals. 40 years meant an entire generation living under death sentence. Picture it. You're 25 years old, healthy, able-bodied. You just learned you'll never see the promise. You'll spend the rest of your existence in tents, wandering until you collapse and perish somewhere in the sand. Your children will inherit everything you refused. You chose this, but living with the consequence is another matter entirely. The exceptions, Caleb and Joshua, stood as living rebuke to everyone else. These 2 alone believed. These 2 alone would cross over. Their survival demonstrated that the sentence wasn't arbitrary or inevitable. Faith would have saved them all. Faithlessness condemned them. The immediate attempt to invade after the decree showed human nature perfectly. After refusing to enter when God commanded, they tried to enter when he forbade it. After claiming conquest was impossible, they attempted it without divine backing. They got everything reversed. Yes when God said no, no when God said yes. Presumption replaced faith. Pride replaced humility. They paid for it with a crushing military defeat at Hormah, whose name means destruction. The 40 years began, a generation condemned, 2 survivors, children waiting to inherit what their parents spurned. The failed counterattack. Desperation after rejection. The Amalekites and Canaanites routed the Israelites at Hormah, driving them back in defeat. This battle occupies only verses in the text, but its theological significance is enormous. It's the first military engagement since departing Egypt, where Israel loses decisively. What made this defeat different from future battles wasn't strategy or numbers. It was timing and authorization. They attacked after God explicitly withdrew his presence. Moses warned them directly, "The Lord is not among you." The ark remained in camp. The cloud stayed stationary. Every sign indicated God's absence, yet they marched regardless. The text describes them as presuming to ascend into the hill country. That word selection matters. Presumption is faith's evil twin. It appears similar, but operates from pride rather than trust. True faith acts because God commands. Presumption acts because humans decide its time. regardless of divine instruction. Their motivation was complex. Partly genuine remorse, "we have sinned," suggests real conviction. Partly desperation. Facing 40 years wandering was unbearable, so they tried to undo the sentence. Partly shame. They'd just been called cowards by implication, so they attempted to prove their courage. The motivations were mixed, but the fundamental error was the same. They sought to claim by human effort what can only be received as divine gift. The defeat at Hormah demonstrated a principle that would repeat throughout Israel's history. God's presence makes victory possible. His absence makes defeat certain. The same cities they'd conquer 40 years later under Joshua proved impregnable now. Nothing about Canaanite military capacity changed. What changed was whether God fought for Israel. The Amalekites' presence in the battle is significant. These were the people who attacked Israel at Rephidim shortly after the Exodus. The cowardly assault on stragglers that prompted God's vow to erase Amalek's memory, now they served as instruments of divine judgment against Israel itself. The people God promised to protect from Amalek fell to Amalekite swords because they'd forfeited divine protection. The Canaanites' participation proved the scouts' fear correct in an ironic way. Yes, Canaanites could defeat Israel, but only when God withdrew. The 10 spies said, "We can't defeat them because they're too strong." The truth was, we can't defeat them if God doesn't fight for us. The scouts measured wrong variables. With God, Canaanite strength was irrelevant. Without God, even weak enemies could crush them. The defeat also validated Joshua and Caleb's earlier claim. Joshua had said, "Their protection has been removed." He meant that divine judgment waited to fall on Canaan through Israel's conquest. The failed attack proved the principle worked in reverse. When Israel's protection was removed, they became vulnerable. Protection came from covenant relationship, not inherent military might. Moses' refusal to accompany them carried weight. In his role as mediator, Moses embodied the presence of God himself. Wherever Moses traveled, the cloud accompanied him. When Moses remained within the camp, God's presence stayed as well. Their choice to launch an attack without Moses blessing it or taking part in it was, in essence, a choice to go to war without God's backing. It was spiritual self-destruction masquerading as bravery. The ark staying behind in camp drove this point home with undeniable force. The ark symbolized God's throne, his dwelling among the people. It normally went ahead of them into battle. When it remained behind, so did any possibility of winning. They marched against their enemies lacking their most powerful weapon, which wasn't swords or spears, but rather the presence of the Lord who had always fought on their behalf. The distance they were pursued, all the way to Hormah, points to total defeat. They didn't simply lose the battle. They ran away in terror, while enemies pursued and cut them down as they retreated. The defeat was absolute, shameful, and completely foreseeable. Moses had given them explicit warning. They disregarded his words and paid the price without delay. The aftermath of this battle receives no detailed description in the text. How many perished? Was it hundreds? Perhaps thousands? The text remains silent, and this silence itself communicates something important. The actual numbers carried less weight than the underlying principle. They had learned, or at least should have learned, that obedience needs to come before victory, that timing matters just as much as bravery, that human initiative lacking divine approval is not merely useless but actually worse than doing nothing. This episode also signaled the real start of the 40 years. The sentence had been declared. They had attempted to overturn it through force of arms. Their attempt had failed. Now came the acceptance. Reluctant, resentful acceptance, but acceptance all the same. Going back to Egypt was impossible. Moving forward to Canaan was forbidden. Only the endless in-between remained, wandering, waiting, dying. The defeat at Hormah stands as a bookend to a future triumph at this same location. In years to come, under divine command, they would conquer this very area. Same geography, different generation, completely opposite outcome. The physical location remained constant. What changed was whether they moved according to God's command or their own arrogance. Presumption attempts to seize blessing according to human terms and human timing. Faith receives blessing according to divine terms and divine timing. The gap separating these two approaches is measured in dead bodies scattered throughout the hill country, struck down not for being cowards, but for being faithless. Faithless when ordered to enter, faithless when ordered to wait. They couldn't grasp the rhythm, couldn't master the lesson of moving when God said move, and stopping when God said stop. Act 3. The extended purgatory, existence in the waiting room. 40 years. A complete generation living under sentence of death. The narrative changes here, becomes broken up, episodic. Long periods of time pass with scarcely a verse acknowledging them. The structure itself expresses the experience. Time held in suspension, life in limbo, years bleeding together in repetitive patterns of wandering and making camp. The people appearing in these chapters are primarily the next generation. Children coming of age, knowing their parents are doomed, that they're walking through a graveyard in the making. Every adult in their lives is dying. Some die quickly, others linger, but all are moving toward the identical end. The wilderness transforms into an enormous hospice. Daily routines continued with bizarre normalcy. People got married, gave birth to children, looked after livestock. The tabernacle still occupied the camp's center. Sacrifices still burned on the altar. Festivals still marked the passing year. Passover, reminding them of leaving Egypt. The Day of Atonement, purifying the community from sin. The Feast of Booths, recalling wilderness life they were still experiencing. The patterns of religious and household life provided framework to the void. But beneath the routine, everyone understood. This was no longer preparation for conquest. This was waiting for parents and grandparents to die so their children could attempt what their elders had refused. The entire nation became a procession moving toward mass burials. The laws delivered during this period take on an unusual quality. Instructions concerning offerings, festivals, ritual purity. All of these presume future stability in the Promised Land. The condemned generation creates legislation for a future they will never witness. They establish legal frameworks for cities they will never live in, agricultural practices they will never carry out, social structures they will never experience firsthand. They're composing someone else's instruction manual. This created strange tension, legislating hope while living out despair. Every new law served as a reminder of what they had forfeited. Every statute dealing with planting vineyards or constructing houses became an accusation regarding their decision at Kadesh. Yet the laws needed to be delivered now, preserved now, so the coming generation would understand how to live once they crossed over. The wilderness itself provided instruction. Water came sporadically. Sometimes God brought it forth from rocks. Sometimes they discovered oases. Sometimes they went thirsty. Food arrived daily. Manna every morning with the exception of the Sabbath. But manna never varied. 40 years of identical meals, morning after morning, keeping them alive but monotonous beyond belief. Life stripped down to bare survival. The cloud continued to guide them, but now its movements led them nowhere. Circling back, retracing steps, wandering through regions they had already passed through. They were no longer marching toward conquest. They were marking time, following meaningless paths through empty wasteland. The pillar that once signified direction now simply moved them from one barren location to another. Children born in the wilderness knew nothing else. Egypt was something their parents talked about. Canaan was a promise they had heard described but never seen with their own eyes. Their complete existence consisted of tents, the cloud, manna, and the awareness that they would receive what their parents had rejected. They were being raised on loss and promise at the same time. The older generation lived with intensifying bitterness. Some probably maintained their faith, trusting God in spite of the sentence. Others likely grew increasingly resentful as the years accumulated. You can picture the conversations. We're dying because the spies frightened us? Because we wanted meat? Because we didn't have enough trust? That makes us deserve 40 years of wandering? The questions had no satisfying answers. Only the harsh reality that choices produce consequences. Moses himself grew old during these years. He had been 80 at the time of the Exodus, so he was moving toward 120. The leader who had brought them out would die before bringing them in. His own sentence, though based on different reasons, meant he shared the destiny of those he was leading. He would look at the Jordan from Mount Nebo, but never cross it. The death rate must have been staggering in its scope. 600,000 men translates to roughly 1.5 to 2 million total population. If they all died across 40 years, that amounts to approximately 40 to 50,000 deaths each year, more than 100 every single day. Each day, burials taking place. Each week, multiple families in mourning. Death became normalized, anticipated, the background noise of everyday existence. Some surely attempted to make the best of circumstances. You can imagine parents telling their children, "Learn from our error. Trust God when you enter the land. Don't duplicate our failure." Others probably turned cynical, bitter, passing to the next generation resentment rather than faith. The wilderness years molded that second generation's character just as powerfully as the Exodus had shaped the first generations. The absence of narrative detail in these chapters reflects the tedium itself. Few events received documentation because few events occurred. They wandered. They set up camp. They moved again. They camped once more. Years went by. People died. The same activities repeated endlessly. The text provides just enough to let you feel the grinding repetition without forcing you to read through 40 years of daily trivia. But that's precisely the point. This was punishment, not active torture, but existence stripped of meaning. They lived without purpose beyond staying alive, without goal beyond waiting for death, without hope beyond what their children might inherit. The sentence was boredom, futility, and the gradual realization that you chose this, that the land was right there, and you said no. The location names that receive mention during this period, Rithma, Rimmon Perez, Libnah, Rissa, Kehelatha, carry no significance for us. They probably meant nothing to them either. Random spots in the wilderness where they paused briefly. No importance, no memorable events, simply coordinates in a 40-year drift through emptiness. Yet even in this purgatory, God remained present. The tabernacle traveled alongside them. The presence that had judged them also accompanied them. They couldn't escape back to Egypt. They couldn't advance toward Canaan, but they weren't abandoned. God stayed with them, sustaining them through their sentence, maintaining covenant even after they had violated it. The tragedy deepened as years continued passing. Children became adults knowing their parents, that entire generation, was condemned. Those adults had children who would be the generation to actually enter the land. 3 generations coexisted in the wilderness: the condemned, the transitional, and the inheritors, all living together in tents, all moving according to the cloud's direction, all suspended between Egypt and Canaan. Some probably died still bitter, never accepting God's justice as fair. Others died repentant, hoping their children would succeed where they failed. A few perhaps died at peace, having learned through decades of wandering that God's way was correct even when severe. The text doesn't tell us these details. It simply records that they died and were buried in the wilderness, graves scattered across miles upon miles of sand and rock. This middle section of Numbers constitutes the book's dark center. Not the rebellion scenes. Those are dramatic, theologically dense. This is the aftermath, the consequence lived out day after empty day, year after year. A generation dying slowly, while the next one waits to receive their inheritance. Act 3 isn't exciting. It's deliberately tedious, reflecting the actual lived experience of those years. You're intended to feel the heaviness, the emptiness, the grinding passage of time without any progress. This is what faithlessness costs. Not spectacular judgment, but the slow death of promise, postponed without end. The second rebellion, Korah's democratic uprising. At some point during the 40 years, the text doesn't specify exactly when, a Levite named Korah organized opposition. He was a Kohathite from the clan responsible for carrying the tabernacle's most sacred objects, high-ranking among Levites, but not ordained as a priest. That distinction mattered greatly. Korah recruited allies, Dathan and Abiram from the tribe of Reuben, along with 250 respected leaders from throughout the community, prominent men, council members. The rebellion was organized, sophisticated, and crossed tribal boundaries. This wasn't mob violence. It was political challenge with structure. Their arguments sounded reasonable, almost democratic in nature. You've gone too far. Everyone in the community is holy, every single one of them, and the Lord is among them all. Why then do you elevate yourselves above the Lord's assembly? The claim possessed theological coherence. Back at Sinai, God had declared, "You will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Holiness belonged to the entire community, not exclusively to Moses and Aaron. Every Israelite was consecrated, set apart. So, why did Moses monopolize leadership? Why did Aaron's family alone function as priests? Wasn't this tyranny disguised as divine calling? Moses' response revealed how seriously he regarded the challenge. He fell face down, a posture expressing humility but also alarm. Then he addressed Korah and his followers. In the morning, the Lord will reveal who belongs to him, who is holy, and who he will bring near to himself. The one he chooses, he will bring near. Do this. Take censers, Korah and all your followers. Tomorrow, place fire in them and add incense before the Lord. Then the man the Lord chooses will be the Holy One. It's you Levites who have gone too far. Moses then reframed the entire rebellion. Listen, you Levites. Isn't it enough that the God of Israel has separated you from the Israelite community to bring you near himself, to perform the work at the Lord's tabernacle, and to stand before the community ministering to them? He's brought you near, and all your fellow Levites alongside you. But now you're pursuing the priesthood as well. Therefore you and your followers have conspired against the Lord. As for Aaron, who is he that you should complain about him? Moses then summoned Dathan and Abiram. They refused to come, sending back a defiant message instead. Isn't it enough that you brought us up from a land flowing with milk and honey to have us die in the wilderness? Now you also want to lord it over us as well. What's more, you haven't brought us to a land flowing with milk and honey, or given us an inheritance of fields and vineyards. Will you gouge out the eyes of these men? We will not come. Their accusation inverted reality in its entirety. They called Egypt a land flowing with milk and honey, the exact phrase reserved for Canaan. They accused Moses of failed leadership, claiming he had promised land and delivered death. The charge was slander, but effective slander, reframing the narrative to position Moses as the villain and themselves as victims. Moses became angry, which was rare for him. He told God, "Do not accept their offering. I haven't taken one donkey from them, or wronged a single one of them." Then he instructed Korah, "You and your followers are to appear before the Lord tomorrow, you, they, and Aaron. Each man is to take his censer, place incense on it, and present it before the Lord, 250 censers. You and Aaron are also to present your censers." The next day they assembled as instructed. Each man took his censer, placed fire and incense in it, and stood with Moses and Aaron at the tabernacle entrance. Korah gathered the entire community against them at the entrance. Then the Lord's glory appeared to the whole community. God spoke to Moses and Aaron, "Separate yourselves from this community so I may consume them in an instant." They fell face down again, pleading, "God, God of the spirits of all flesh, when one man sins, will you vent your wrath on the entire community?" God responded, "Tell the community, move away from the dwellings of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram." Moses went to Dathan and Abiram, the elders following behind him. He warned the community, "Move away from the tents of these wicked men. Don't touch anything that belongs to them, or you'll be swept away because of all their sins." People moved back from the dwellings as instructed. Dathan and Abiram came out and stood at their tent entrances with their wives, children, and infants. Moses announced, "This is how you'll know the Lord sent me to do all these things, and that it wasn't my own idea. If these men die naturally like everyone else, then the Lord hasn't sent me. But if the Lord brings about something unprecedented, if the ground opens and swallows them with everything that belongs to them, so they go down alive into Sheol, then you'll know these men have despised the Lord." The moment he finished speaking, the ground split open beneath them. The earth opened and swallowed them, their households, all Korah's people, and all their possessions. They descended alive into Sheol with everything that belonged to them. The earth closed over them, and they vanished from the assembly. All Israel surrounding them fled at their cries, shouting, "The earth might swallow us as well." Fire came from the Lord, and consumed the 250 men offering incense. The next day the whole community complained against Moses and Aaron, "You have ended the Lord's people." As they assembled against Moses and Aaron and turned toward the tabernacle, the cloud covered it, and the Lord's glory appeared. Moses and Aaron went to the front of the tent. God told Moses, "Get away from this community, so I may consume them in an instant." They fell face down. Moses told Aaron, "Take your censer, place fire from the altar in it, add incense, and go quickly to the community to make atonement for them, because wrath has come from the Lord. The plague has already begun." Aaron did as Moses instructed. He ran into the assembly. The plague had already started among the people, but Aaron offered incense and made atonement. He stood between the deceased and the living, and the plague was stopped. Those who died from the plague numbered 14,700, besides those who died because of the Korah incident. The rebellion exposed several tensions running through the community. First, the appeal to communal holiness versus mediated holiness. Yes, all Israel was holy, but holiness required order, structure, proper separation. Approaching God carelessly meant death even for those who were holy. Priests mediated precisely because unmediated encounter with holiness proved lethal. Second, the challenge to leadership structure. Korah's argument assumed authority was a human power grab. Moses countered that authority came from divine appointment. The earth opening wasn't Moses' doing. It was God vindicating his chosen mediator. Third, the persistence of rebellion even after judgment. Even after earthquake and fire, the community blamed Moses and Aaron the very next day. You ended the Lord's people, as if Moses controlled the ground or the fire. Their complaint demonstrated determined refusal to accept divine judgment. Fourth, Aaron's role as life-giver. The man accused of false priesthood literally stood between living and deceased, his incense stopping the plague. His mediation saved thousands. The priestly function was demonstrated as grace, not tyranny. The rebellion's sophistication made it particularly dangerous. This wasn't hungry people craving meat. This was theological and political challenge wrapped in the language of equality and democracy. Korah offered an appealing vision: flat hierarchy, distributed holiness, leadership by consensus. It sounded progressive. It proved deadly. What went wrong? 12 men saw the identical land. They all agreed on the facts: fertile soil, fortified cities, powerful inhabitants, giant warriors. Yet they reached opposite conclusions. 10 said conquest was impossible. 2 said it was certain. The division wasn't about data. It was about interpretation, specifically about what you believe regarding God. The majority saw the obstacles and concluded they were insurmountable. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. The blooming staff, God's chosen sign of legitimate authority. The ground had opened up. Families disappeared into the earth. Fire consumed the rebels. The camp stood in shock and fear. The question still remained: who speaks for God? Who mediates between the holy and the common? Korah had claimed everyone possessed equal access to the divine. The earth's answer suggested otherwise, but doubt persisted. Perhaps the catastrophe was merely coincidence. Perhaps Moses had manipulated events somehow. The people needed something more than destruction. They needed a sign of life. God instructed each tribal leader to bring a wooden staff, 12 rods, 1 for each tribe. Aaron's staff represented Levi. These weren't ceremonial objects of any kind. They were dead wood, cut branches, completely lifeless. Moses placed them in the tent of meeting before the Ark of the Covenant. Overnight, something impossible took place. Morning arrived. Moses entered the sacred space and retrieved the staffs. 11 remained exactly as they were, dry, unchanged, dead wood. Aaron's staff had undergone transformation. Buds emerged along its entire length. Blossoms opened up. Almonds appeared fully formed and ripe. The complete life cycle of a tree compressed into one night on a branch severed from its roots. The symbolism cuts profoundly deep. Human ambition produces nothing of substance. Korah's rhetoric, however sophisticated it sounded, remains sterile. Political maneuvering bears no fruit. Authority seized by force stays barren and lifeless. Aaron did nothing different. He brought dead wood like everyone else. The difference came from divine choice alone. God's selection produces life. His appointment bears fruit. His designated mediator channels blessing, not because of personal merit, but because God declares it to be so. The almond tree matters significantly. This tree blooms first in the ancient Near East, while winter still grips the land. It signals watchfulness, awakening, God's attention to his people. The Hebrew word for almond shares roots with the word meaning to watch. Aaron's rod proclaimed that God watches over his chosen means of mediation. This wasn't magic or sleight of hand. It was grammar, divine communication through object lesson. The staff said what words could not adequately convey. Priesthood is a gift, not an achievement. Mediation exists by grace, not by democratic vote or popular acclaim. The people received their answer not through argument, but through undeniable witness. Aaron's authority came from the same source as the staff's fruit, God's inexplicable sovereign choice. Moses placed the staff before the ark permanently, a standing testimony for all time. Future generations would see it and remember. When ambition rises, when egalitarian impulses challenge established structure, when someone asks, "Why him and not me?" the blooming staff answers, "Because God said so, because life comes only from his hand." The rod remained in place, a memorial, a warning, a comfort. Some structures exist not by human design, but by divine necessity. Mediation between holy God and sinful people requires divine appointment. Otherwise, everyone approaching the sacred space dies. Korah wanted democracy in religious structure. God insisted on designated grace. The earth swallowed rebellion. The staff bloomed with life. Both proclaimed the same truth from different directions. Authority that serves becomes life-giving. Authority that grasps becomes death-dealing. Aaron didn't reach for the roll. It reached for him. His staff didn't force fruit to appear. Fruit appeared as pure gift. The almond blossoms fell eventually. The almonds were eaten and gone. But the wood remained, testifying. Life springs from dead things only when God chooses to make it so. No amount of human effort, clever argument, or popular support can manufacture what only divine selection produces. The camp learned to live with hierarchy, not because tyranny deserves acceptance, but because mediation deserves gratitude. Someone stands between them and consuming holiness. That someone must be chosen by God, or the mediation itself becomes deadly. The waters of Meribah, Moses' fatal mistake, 40 years compressed into silence and absence. The text says almost nothing about these decades. The first generation died slowly, one by one, until their bones lay scattered across the wilderness. Their children grew up, learned hard lessons, watched their parents' judgment unfold over time. Then, right on the edge of fulfillment, the cycle repeated itself. The new generation, not yet hardened by extended trial, faced the old crisis: no water. They gathered against Moses and Aaron in complaint. The complaints sounded disturbingly familiar. "Why did you bring us to this terrible place? Why did you lead us out of Egypt to perish in the desert?" The words echoed their parents' rebellion as if trauma carried forward in language itself. Moses had heard this before, decades earlier. At another place, without water, God told him to strike the rock. Water poured forth abundantly. The people drank. Crisis averted. This time God gave different instructions. Take the staff, gather the assembly, speak to the rock before their eyes. Water would flow out. The command was specific and clear. Speak, not strike. Words, not violence. Rhetoric, not force. Moses and Aaron gathered the people before the rock as instructed. Frustration boiled over inside Moses. He spoke, but not to the rock, to the people instead. "Listen, you rebels. Must we bring you water from this rock?" The words dripped with contempt, exhaustion, rage accumulated over 40 years of dealing with complaints. The shift from God's provision to we was subtle but fatal. He raised the staff once, then twice. He struck the rock with force. Water gushed out, abundant, miraculous, exactly what they needed. The people drank deeply. The crisis ended. But something broke that couldn't be repaired. God spoke to Moses and Aaron immediately afterward. "Because you did not trust me to show my holiness before the people, you will not bring this assembly into the land I'm giving them." The sentence seems harsh on the surface. Water flowed, after all. The miracle worked. What exactly was the crime? The text calls the place Meribah, meaning quarreling. But the deeper issue wasn't the people's complaint. It was Moses' response to it. God intended to display his character through gentle speech, words calling forth provision, grace manifesting through verbal invitation. Moses displayed something else entirely: anger, frustration, power exercised through violence against stone. The striking suggested water came by force, by human effort, by Moses and Aaron's exasperation finally making the rock yield to their will. The rhetoric mattered enormously. Moses called them rebels, which was technically accurate, but pastorally devastating. He claimed the miracle as our action, obscuring divine agency completely. He struck twice, suggesting the first blow wasn't sufficient. That provision required repeated human effort. Every single detail communicated wrong theology. God wanted the people to see him as generous provider who responds to requests. Moses showed them an angry leader beating resources from reluctant nature. The staff Moses carried bore great significance. It wasn't his staff at all. It was Aaron's rod, the one that bloomed, the instrument of divine choice, of life springing from dead wood by God's sovereign grace. Using it to strike in anger profaned its meaning completely. Moses' sin wasn't disobedience alone. It was failed communication, distorted witness, misrepresenting God's character at a crucial teaching moment. The people needed to learn that God gives freely and generously. Moses taught them the opposite. The punishment fits perfectly when you understand it. Moses brought people to the edge of promise through 40 years of intercession, leadership, and personal sacrifice. But he couldn't complete the journey. He modeled law brilliantly. He couldn't embody the grace needed for entrance. Someone else would lead them across the Jordan. Joshua, whose name means God saves, would bring them into the land. The transition from Moses to Joshua enacted theology. Law brings you to the boundary. Grace carries you through. Moses accepted the sentence without recorded protest. Perhaps he understood completely. Perhaps decades of carrying impossible burdens had prepared him for this final lesson in human limitation. Even the greatest prophet remains human. Even the humblest man on earth has moments where frustration overwhelms calling. The water still flowed abundantly. God's provision continued despite failed mediation. The people drank regardless of Moses' error. Grace persisted through human weakness, but consequences remained nonetheless. Moses would see the land from Nebo's heights. He would not enter it. Meribah became a double memorial: God's faithfulness and human limitation. Abundant water and a barred entrance. Miracle and tragedy flowing from the same rock in the same moment. The bronze serpent, a paradox of salvation. The people spoke against God and Moses again. The complaints were familiar by this point. No bread, no water. We hate this miserable food. The cycle of ingratitude continued even among those who should have learned from their parents' fate. God's response was immediate and terrifying. Venomous serpents entered the camp. The text calls them seraphim, burning ones. Their bite inflamed flesh. People died in agony. The wilderness, which had provided manna and quail, now provided death. The people recognized their sin quickly this time. They came to Moses with confession. We sinned. We spoke against God and against you. Pray to God to remove the serpents from us. Moses interceded, as he always did, but God's answer twisted expectation. He didn't remove the serpents. The threat remained present. Instead, he provided a way to survive within the danger. Make a serpent of bronze, God instructed. Set it on a pole. Anyone bitten should look at it. Those who looked would live. Moses obeyed exactly. He fashioned the bronze serpent and raised it high where everyone could see it clearly. The remedy seemed completely absurd. Look at an image of the thing destroying you. Gaze upon a metal replica of your death. This will save you somehow. Yet it worked. Those bitten, with venom coursing through their bodies, looked up at the bronze serpent. They lived. Those who refused to look, perhaps thinking the cure too simple or too strange, died from their wounds. The paradox cuts to the heart of biblical soteriology. Salvation comes through the symbol of judgment. Healing arrives by facing the instrument of death. The serpent on the pole embodies both curse and cure, wound and remedy, in a single image. The serpent carried weight beyond the immediate crisis. In Eden, the serpent brought death through deception. Here, a serpent brings life through honest confrontation. The bronze material mattered, permanent, reflective, crafted by human hands at divine command. Not a living serpent, but its essential form, death's shape emptied of death's power. Looking required something profound from the people. It demanded trust that defied reason completely. Your body burns with venom. Your flesh swells. Death approaches steadily. And the cure is to stare at a metal snake? The action seemed ridiculous, ineffective, far too simple. But simplicity was precisely the point. Salvation doesn't come through complex ritual or heroic effort. It comes through trust, through looking away from yourself and toward what God provides, no matter how strange the provision appears. Those who looked acknowledged their need. The act admitted helplessness. You couldn't heal yourself. You couldn't extract the venom. You couldn't earn survival. You could only look, trust, receive. Those who refused to look likely refused to admit their condition was beyond self-remedy. Perhaps they tried other cures, herbal remedies, incantations, anything but the absurd bronze serpent. Pride interferes with survival when the cure humbles us. The serpent stayed raised for the entire journey ahead, a permanent reminder. Some tradition suggests it was placed in the tabernacle eventually. Generations later, it required destruction. People began worshiping it, burning incense to it, calling it Nehushtan, meaning bronze thing. Even instruments of grace become idols when we forget they merely point beyond themselves. But in the wilderness, it served its purpose perfectly. Life came through looking. Healing came through facing judgment's image. Salvation came through the strangest means imaginable, staring at what could terminate you transformed into what preserves you. The mechanics remained mysterious. Why did looking heal? The text doesn't explain the mechanism. No magic in the bronze, no power in the metal itself. The serpent simply directed faith toward God's promise. He said, "Look and live." Those who trusted the word, despite its strangeness, survived. The living serpents never left the camp. They remained present, a constant danger. But their threat lost power over those who knew where to look. The bronze serpent didn't eliminate danger from their lives. It provided a way through danger. Salvation doesn't always mean removal of threat. Sometimes it means grace to endure within threat's presence. Balaam's donkey, the comedy that subverts prophecy. The story shifts tone dramatically. After serpents and divine judgment, we encounter something unexpected. Comedy, satire, a talking animal, and a prophet who can't see what his donkey perceives clearly. Balak, king of Moab, watched the people advancing. He saw what happened to the Amorites. Their armies fell completely, their cities were taken, terror gripped him deeply. Military opposition seemed utterly futile. So he reached for spiritual weapons instead. He sent messengers to Balaam, a renowned diviner living far to the east near the Euphrates River. The message was direct and clear. Come, curse these people for me. They're too powerful. Perhaps if you curse them, I can defeat them and drive them away. I know that those you bless stay blessed, and those you curse stay cursed. The request recognized something true. Words have power. Prophetic speech shapes reality. Balaam's reputation extended across kingdoms. If anyone could curse effectively, he could. Balaam asked the messengers to wait overnight. God spoke to him that night. Don't go with them. Don't curse the people because they're blessed. Morning came. Balaam sent the messengers away. God said no. Simple answer, but Balak persisted. He sent more messengers, more distinguished ones, with promises of great honor and substantial payment. Balaam's response reveals his character clearly. He claimed he couldn't go against God's word, even for a palace full of silver and gold. Noble speech indeed. But then he asked them to stay the night while he inquired of God again. Why ask twice? God already said no. The second inquiry betrayed underlying desire. Balaam wanted the reward. He wanted permission to do what he knew was prohibited. God gave troubling permission. Go with them, but speak only what I tell you. The permission carried serious warning. Balaam saddled his donkey and departed with the Moabite princes. Then the narrative turned completely strange. God's anger burned because Balaam went, but God gave permission. The text creates deliberate tension. Permission doesn't always mean approval. God sometimes lets people pursue their desires to expose their hearts. An angel of the Lord stood in the road, sword drawn and ready. The donkey saw it clearly. Balaam didn't see anything. The animal turned aside into a field. Balaam struck the donkey, forcing it back to the path. The angel appeared again, this time where the path narrowed between vineyard walls. The donkey pressed against the wall, crushing Balaam's foot. He struck the animal again. The angel appeared a third time where no room remained to turn. The donkey lay down under Balaam. His rage erupted completely. He beat the donkey with his staff. Then God opened the donkey's mouth. The animal spoke. What have I done to you that you've struck me 3 times? Balaam answered without apparent shock. You've made a fool of me. If I had a sword, I'd end you right now. The donkey responded with devastating logic. Am I not your donkey, which you've ridden all your life until today? Have I ever done this to you before? No, Balaam admitted. Then God opened Balaam's eyes. He saw the angel, sword drawn, standing in the path. Balaam fell face down immediately. The angel spoke. Why did you strike your donkey 3 times? I came to oppose you because your path is reckless before me. The donkey saw me and turned away 3 times. If it hadn't, I would have eliminated you by now, but spared the donkey. Think about the layers of absurdity here. A renowned prophet can't see what his donkey perceives. An animal shows more spiritual sensitivity than a professional diviner. The beast speaks more reasonably than its master. The one who curses for money gets rebuked by his means of transportation. The satire bites deeply. Balaam claims to speak for God, but can't perceive God's messenger standing right in front of him. He beats the very creature saving his life. His spiritual blindness becomes literal, comic, and ultimately humiliating. Yet God permits him to continue. Go to Balak, but speak only my words. The setup is complete. A prophet with a reputation for effective curses, hired to curse people God has blessed, who can't even see angels his donkey perceives. The subsequent scenes deliver the punchline repeatedly. Balak takes Balaam to high places overlooking the camp. Altars are built, sacrifices are offered. The elaborate ritual begins. Balaam opens his mouth to curse. Blessings pour out instead. 4 times this happens. 4 prophetic oracles, each more glowing than the last. Balak's frustration builds with each one. That's not what I'm paying you for. Stop blessing them. Balaam shrugs helplessly. I told you. I can only speak what God puts in my mouth. The curses won't come. God has blessed them. No divination can change it. No magic can counter it. The people are blessed because God says so. The final oracle goes further. Balaam prophesies future triumph. A star rises from Jacob, a scepter from the people's tribes. Moab will be conquered, Edom subdued. Even Amalek faces doom. Balak's plot backfires completely. He hired someone to weaken his enemies. Instead, they're blessed repeatedly in poetic, memorable form. The comedy is cosmic. Human schemes against God's declared purpose become their own refutation. The donkey episode establishes this perfectly. Before we hear the oracles, we see Balaam's true character. He's spiritually blind despite professional credentials. He's motivated by gain despite pious language. He ignores clear warning despite claiming prophetic sensitivity. His donkey is more righteous than he is. The message is clear. God's blessing on the people doesn't depend on their merit. It depends on His choice. No curse can touch them because God has spoken differently. Even a compromised prophet becomes a mouthpiece for truth when God determines what will be said. The story functions as comedy, but comedy with teeth. It mocks human pretension. It satirizes prophets for hire. It demonstrates divine sovereignty through humiliating circumstances. Balaam wanted gold. He got theological precision forced through his mouth. Balak wanted curses. He got an enemy repeatedly blessed in his presence. The donkey never speaks again. That single miraculous conversation serves its purpose. It reveals what needs revealing. A beast with clearer sight than a seer. An animal with more sense than a prophet. 3 times it saves its master's life. 3 times it's beaten for the service. Grace sometimes comes through unlikely messengers. Truth sometimes speaks through unexpected mouths. And sometimes God's sovereignty displays itself most clearly when He makes a donkey wiser than a prophet. The Baal of Peor, seduction at the finish line. The people camped at Shittim in the plains of Moab, with the Jordan River visible to the west. 40 years of wandering neared completion. The new generation had proven itself in battle against Amorite kings. Victory seemed inevitable. The land was within reach. Then they fell, not to armies but to seduction. Moabite women came to the camp. They invited the men to sacrifices for their gods. The people accepted the invitation. They ate ritual meals. They bowed to foreign deities. The text states it plainly. The people yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor. This wasn't casual cultural exchange. The Baal of Peor involved ritualized immorality as worship. The god's cult centered on fertility rites, sacred unions, and deliberate boundary violations. What Israel encountered wasn't mere religious pluralism. It was comprehensive seduction, physical, spiritual, and communal. The combination proved devastating. Where military threats had failed, intimate invitation succeeded. Where curses couldn't touch them, desire did. The people walked willingly into what no enemy could force them into. Covenant betrayal at the threshold of fulfillment. God's anger burned. A plague broke out immediately. People began dying in numbers that dwarfed battlefield casualties. The text reports 24,000 died before the plague stopped. Moses received instructions. Take all the leaders who joined the apostasy, execute them in broad daylight before God. The severity matched the crime. This wasn't private sin. It was public betrayal of national covenant at the most critical moment. Then an incident crystallized the whole crisis. While the people wept at the tent of meeting, while the plague raged, while Moses and the leaders dealt with the catastrophe, a man from the tribe of Simeon brought a Midianite woman into the camp, into his family, publicly, brazenly, in direct sight of everyone. Phinehas, Aaron's grandson, saw it happening. He took a spear, followed the couple into the tent, and drove the spear through both of them. The plague stopped immediately. The text presents this without moral ambiguity. Phinehas' zeal turned away wrath from the people. His action honored God's demand for holiness at the boundary. God confirmed it with a covenant of lasting priesthood for Phinehas' descendants. His zeal earned perpetual priestly status. Modern readers struggle with this passage. The violence seems excessive, the sexual dimension uncomfortable, the divine approval of Phinehas' act troubling. But the ancient context clarifies what's at stake. The people stood at the finish line. Everything their parents lost through unbelief, this generation could gain through trust. The land waited. God's promises approached fulfillment. At this exact moment, wholesale abandonment of covenant would nullify everything. 40 years in the wilderness would become meaningless if they entered the land already compromised, already unfaithful, already syncretized with Canaanite religion. The plague wasn't arbitrary divine anger. It was consequence. Covenant violation brings death because covenant sustained life in the first place. The relationship with God enabled everything: the Exodus, the wilderness survival, the military victories. Breaking that relationship removed the foundation. Death followed naturally. Phinehas' act stopped the plague because it represented the community's rejection of the betrayal. One man's public zeal symbolized what should have been everyone's response. The brazen couple represented the crisis. Phinehas' spear represented resolution. The community's tolerance had to end for the community's survival. The strategic timing reveals deeper pattern. This wasn't random temptation. Balak couldn't curse them. Balaam's oracles blessed them instead. But Balaam gave Balak advice, tradition records. If you can't curse them, corrupt them. Lead them into sin. God will judge them himself. The Moabite Midianite seduction followed this strategy precisely. External opposition failed completely. Internal corruption succeeded. Where frontal assault was repelled, subtle infiltration worked. Where military defeat was impossible, moral compromise achieved the same result. The danger wasn't merely physical desire. It was theological erosion. The Baal of Peor offered a competing vision: fertility without faithfulness, pleasure without covenant, religious experience without exclusive loyalty. The people could have everything. Their God and these gods, their identity and Moabite practices, their distinctiveness and cultural integration, this illusion almost destroyed them. You cannot serve both. You cannot maintain covenant while embracing what covenant explicitly forbids. The land they were about to enter was full of these temptations. Canaanite religion permeated the culture. If they couldn't resist at Shittim, they would dissolve in Canaan. The plague's death toll exceeded losses from the golden calf incident. The severity matched the proximity to fulfillment. They had one task left: cross the river and take possession. The tragedy was dying at the door, perishing at the threshold, losing everything within sight of having it all. 24,000 died. The survivors learned the hardest lesson yet. The greatest danger isn't external opposition, it's internal compromise. The deadliest threat isn't the enemy you face in battle, it's the seduction you welcome into camp. The crisis also exposed who they really were at this point. A generation tempered by their parents' failure, tested by wilderness discipline, victorious in initial battles, yet still vulnerable to the oldest temptation. The belief that you can have God's promises while ignoring God's terms. Phineas' spear created a memorial. His zeal established a standard. His descendants would serve as priests precisely because he demonstrated what priesthood requires. Willingness to act when the community's covenant life hangs in balance, even when action costs everything. The plague ended, the dead were buried, the people purified themselves, and the lesson remained carved into memory by loss. Victory comes through faithfulness, not merely through strength. Defeat comes through compromise, not merely through battle. The finish line is where you're most vulnerable, not most secure. They would remember Shittim. The name itself, acacias, would carry bitter weight. Beautiful trees, dark memory, the place where they almost lost everything within sight of receiving it all. A new generation, the second census and daughters' rights. After the plague, God commanded another census. Count the people again, take a full military registration. The first census happened at Sinai at the journey's beginning. This second census happened on the plains of Moab at the journey's end. The numbers tell the story. The first census counted 603,550 fighting men. The second census counted 601,730. Nearly identical totals, completely different people. Every man counted in the first census had died. Not one crossed over. Joshua and Caleb alone survived from the original military age population. The second census counted entirely new individuals, sons who watched their father's generation perish, men who existed because of their parents' failure and God's patience. The census wasn't merely administrative. It served theological purpose. The new generation was complete, ready, numerous enough, strong enough. The wilderness hadn't depleted them. 40 years of wandering hadn't destroyed the nation. They emerged from judgment prepared for conquest. The census also determined inheritance portions. The land would be divided according to tribal size. Each clan would receive territory proportional to their numbers. The census linked present reality to future possession. Your place in the wilderness counted toward your place in the land. But then something unprecedented occurred. 5 women stepped forward with a legal challenge that would reshape inheritance law. Zelophehad, from the tribe of Manasseh, had died in the wilderness. He left 5 daughters, Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah, no sons. Under existing law, their father's name and inheritance would disappear. His portion would dissolve into the tribe's general holdings. His daughters would become dependent on male relatives, receiving nothing in their own right. The daughters approached Moses, Eleazar the priest, the leaders, and the entire assembly at the tent of meeting's entrance, public setting. Official forum. They presented their case clearly. Why should our father's name disappear from his clan because he had no son? Give us property among our father's relatives. The request was revolutionary. Women didn't inherit land. Property passed through male lines exclusively. This preserved family holdings, prevented fragmentation, and maintained patriarchal structures. The daughters weren't asking for exception. They were challenging the entire system. Moses didn't answer immediately. He brought their case before God. God's response affirmed them completely. The daughters of Zelophehad speak rightly. You must certainly give them property as an inheritance among their father's relatives. Transfer their father's inheritance to them. Then God expanded the principle into permanent law. If a man dies without sons, his inheritance passes to daughters. If no daughters, to his brothers. If no brothers, to his father's brothers. If his father has no brothers, to the nearest relative. A clear hierarchy. But daughters were now legally recognized heirs. This moment represents more than legal adjustment. It reveals covenant flexibility, divine responsiveness to justice, and women's agency within patriarchal structures. The daughters demonstrated courage. They stood before the nation's leadership, all male, and demanded their rights. They risked rejection, humiliation, and permanent loss. They could have stayed silent, accepted custom, and disappeared into obscurity. Instead, they argued from principle. Their father didn't rebel like Korah. He didn't participate in the golden calf apostasy or the Baal of Peor incident. He died for his own sin like everyone else in his generation, but deserved to be remembered. His name shouldn't vanish because gender determined inheritance. Moses' response demonstrated wisdom. He didn't dismiss them out of hand. He didn't defend existing practice simply because it was traditional. He brought the case to God, admitting the law needed divine clarification. God's verdict validated their claim entirely. The existing law was incomplete. It didn't address their situation fairly. The legal code needed amendment to prevent injustice, and women's voices prompted that amendment. This establishes important precedent. Law isn't static. Covenant doesn't require rigid adherence to forms that produce unintended injustice. When faithful people identify genuine problems, when they argue from covenant principles rather than personal gain, the law can adapt. Later, tribal leaders from Manasseh raised concern. If daughters inherit and then marry men from other tribes, land would transfer between tribes, violating territorial boundaries. God responded with additional regulation. Daughters who inherit must marry within their father's tribe, preserving tribal holdings. The daughters agreed. They married their cousins, staying within Manasseh's clans. Their courage achieved what they sought. Their father's name lived on. His property passed to them, and they became landowners in the promised territory. Their names are recorded permanently: Mahlach, Noach, Hoglach, Milzach, and Tirzach. 5 women who changed inheritance law for every generation after them. Their case established that women could inherit, own land, and participate in covenant community as property holders, not merely as dependents. The timing matters. This happened after the plague, after the crisis of Baal of Peor, after the second census confirmed the new generation's readiness. At the moment of preparation for conquest, God addressed internal justice. Before they took the land, they needed to ensure they would distribute it fairly. The daughters' case also demonstrated something about this new generation. They questioned when questioning served justice. They approached authority respectfully, but firmly. They argued from principle, not merely from personal interest. They represented the kind of faithful engagement with law that strengthens community rather than fractures it. The second census counted them. The legal case vindicated them. The land would include their portion. 5 women who refused to accept injustice as inevitable. 5 daughters who proved that covenant community means continual refinement toward fairness, not rigid preservation of tradition regardless of cost. They inherited. Their father's name remained, and biblical law expanded to include them. The emerging generation was truly prepared, not merely for combat, but for righteousness. The Book of Wars contained lost epic narratives and ceremonial verse. The account briefly cites something uncommon, a portion, a reference, language preserved from materials older than the manuscript itself. From the Book of the Wars of the Lord, Waheb in Suphah and the Valleys of the Arnon. The citation stops suddenly, unfinished, enigmatic. The Book of the Wars of the Lord appears nowhere else in sacred writings. No manuscripts remain. We hold only these scattered verses quoted to mark territorial limits and honor triumphs. This reference uncovers something essential about how ancient manuscripts functioned. The account wasn't composed in a vacuum. It pulled from previous materials, cited existing records, and presumed the audience knew circulating writings. The Book of Wars was evidently recognized widely enough to reference without clarification. What was this vanished book? Most likely a gathering of triumph, hymns, combat poetry, and ceremonial remembrances. Ancient Near Eastern societies kept such gatherings. They fulfilled various functions, safeguarding military records, honoring divine involvement, instructing about geography, and offering liturgical content for celebrations. The portions we have indicate poetic form, rhythmic expression, geographical references, mentions of valleys, waterways, and borders. This wasn't clinical military documentation. It was artistic recognition of God's combat on the people's account. The manuscript quotes these verses when marking territorial limits or clarifying location titles. The verse offered authoritative testimony. Conflicts waged became hymns performed. Military operations evolved into liturgical recollection. The conflicts themselves produced literature that survived the soldiers. Additional poetic portions surface throughout the section: triumph hymns after defeating Sihon, celebrations after subduing Og. These verses share qualities. They're rhythmic, repetitive, geographically precise, and theologically concentrated. They credit triumph to divine activity while documenting human involvement. Notice the sequence. Combat occurs. Triumph arrives. Verse appears. The verse gets gathered. Subsequent generations reference it. The reference confirms authority. The pattern safeguards recollection through artistic structure. This clarifies why the account incorporates verse at pivotal moments. Verse achieves what prose fails to accomplish. It renders recollection transportable. It builds collective expression. It converts personal encounter into communal character. Perform a conflict in song, and communities retain it. Describe it in prose, and they lose it. The Book of Wars probably held hymns from various eras and composers. Some could have reached back to wilderness conflicts. Others could have been incorporated as conquest proceeded. The gathering expanded as triumphs mounted. Each generation added its witness to the growing record. The geographical precision in these portions fulfills intention. Waheb in Suphah and the valleys of the Arnon identifies particular sites. The verse connects recollection to terrain. Travel through these valleys generations afterward, and the verses supply account. The terrain itself transforms into memory instrument. The manuscript also contains mockery and ridicule verses. Following Sihon's defeat, A verse ridicules Moab's deity Chemosh for failing to defend his followers. The verse isn't simply congratulatory. It's theological argument. Your deities failed to rescue you. Our God secured the conflict. The proof exists in your ruined settlements. This exposes ancient combat's spiritual aspect. Conflicts weren't simply political or geographical. They were universal competitions between divinities. Triumph demonstrated whose deity held superior strength. Defeat suggested divine desertion. The verses that honored combat, therefore, bore theological significance far exceeding military documentation. The vanished Book of Wars signified broad tradition. How many verses did it hold? How many conflicts did it honor? How distant did its earliest records extend? We have no answers. The manuscript endures only through these scattered citations, suggestions of a broader literary world now disappeared. Yet the citations themselves prove something significant. The biblical account positioned itself within current literary tradition. It didn't pretend to generate history from emptiness. It cited, quoted, and constructed upon previous materials. The composers knew and anticipated their audience to know these older writings. This indicates a literate society with circulating manuscripts, common traditions, and collective recollections safeguarded through written and spoken structures. The Book of Wars likely existed beside other gatherings, perhaps family records, maybe legal assemblies, possibly prophetic declarations. A complete literary environment, largely vanished, sometimes glimpsed through citation. The verse's ceremonial role deserves attention. These hymns probably went with celebrations, military assemblies, and covenant restoration gatherings. Performing the conflicts strengthened character. Recounting triumphs recalled divine reliability. The verses operated as theology in retainable structure. The portions also expose artistic awareness. Hebrew verse during this era adhered to particular sequences, parallel structure, repeated frameworks, rhythmic flow crafted for retention. The cited verses show refined literary method. This wasn't simple messaging. It was skillful remembrance that harmonized artistic structure with theological substance. The persistence of only portions produces troubling inquiries. How much ancient Israelite literature has disappeared? Which hymns, verses, legal manuscripts, and wisdom gatherings existed but departed without evidence except periodic mentions? The Book of Wars signifies the observable peak of a submerged literary mountain. Still, what persists fulfills intention. The citations confirm that this people had recollection framework. They safeguarded triumphs through expression. They transmitted tradition through excellence. They built enduring witness through language shaped to outlast numerous generations. The conflicts themselves receded into history. The soldiers perished. The combats concluded. But the hymns persisted, at minimum for a period. And even when the Book of Wars itself vanished, these limited quoted passages endured, transmitting ahead a trace of disappeared epic tradition. The people who waged these conflicts also performed them. The people that seized territory also generated verse. Combat and devotion merged. Military operations produced liturgical substance. Every triumph became opportunity for expression. This reminds us that ancient belief wasn't detached theology exclusively. It was experienced reality converted into retainable structure, combat transformed into melody, triumph transformed into composition, seizure transformed into musical celebration. The spiritual existence included not simply sacrifice and regulation, but also excellence, rhythm, and collective performance. The Book of the Wars of the Lord, vanished but formerly essential, referenced but irretrievable. A reminder that we hold portions of a civilization far deeper than remaining manuscripts exclusively disclose. The Transjordan seizure, the unclear initial triumph, the expedition delivered them to the Amorite realm east of the Jordan. Sihon governed from Heshbon, managing territory from the Arnon River upward. The people required passage through his territory to arrive at the water crossing facing Jericho. Moses dispatched messengers to Sihon with a direct appeal, "Let us travel through your territory. We'll remain on the principal route. We won't divert into croplands or vineyards. We won't consume water from wells. We'll merely travel through your domain." Sihon declined. Beyond declining, he assembled his complete force and advanced out to face them at Jahaz. The denial compelled military action. The combat arrived rapidly. The manuscript describes total triumph. They defeated Sihon with a blade, claiming ownership of his complete realm, from the Arnon to the Jabbok, from the desert to the Ammonites. They seized all his settlements and occupied them, including Heshbon and all its neighboring communities. The initial genuine seizure, not wandering, not postponing, actual combat with territorial acquisition. The emerging generation's opening military examination. They succeeded conclusively. They advanced upward. Og, ruler of Bashan, governed the domain north of the Jabbok. He emerged against them at Edrei with his complete strength. God addressed Moses directly, "Don't fear him. I've delivered him over to you, along with all his followers and his territory. Do to him what you accomplished to Sihon." They defeated Og, his descendants, and his complete force. No survivors persisted. They claimed ownership of his territory. The manuscript highlights Og's size and power. His iron sleeping frame measured 9 cubits by 4 cubits, approximately 13 feet by 6 feet. He was among the final of the Rephaim, the ancient enormous ones. Still, he collapsed like any other ruler. 2 realms seized, considerable territory obtained. The people now managed the complete area east of the Jordan, from the Arnon River to Mount Hermon. Fertile territory, quality grazing areas, settlements already constructed, an unexpected reward. Then difficulties surfaced. The groups of Reuben and Gad held substantial herds and animals. They observed the seized territory's worth for livestock. They came to Moses, Eleazar, and the chiefs with a suggestion. "This territory is appropriate for livestock, and we possess livestock. Allow us to occupy here. Don't require us to cross the Jordan." Moses' reaction arrived sharp with fury. "Should your relatives go to combat while you remain here? Why discourage the people from crossing into the territory God is providing them? This is what your ancestors accomplished when I dispatched them from Kadesh Barnea to examine the territory. They discouraged everyone, and that complete generation perished in the desert. Now you're accomplishing the identical thing. Halt here, and God's fury will ignite against the complete assembly again." The charge struck profoundly. Moses observed history repeating. Another generation selecting ease over mission. Another denial to fulfill the assignment. Another choice for quick benefit over covenant completion. The groups responded thoughtfully. They weren't declining to battle. They suggested a settlement. "Allow us to construct enclosures for our livestock and settlements for our households here. Then we'll equip ourselves and advance ahead of the other groups into combat. We won't come back until everyone has obtained their portion across the Jordan. We don't desire portion on the western section because we'll have obtained ours here on the east." Moses approved the conditions with requirements. "If you equip yourselves and battle until the territory is seized, then this domain will be yours. But if you neglect to accomplish this, You'll have violated against God, and your violation will locate you. Construct settlements for your households, and enclosures for your animals, but accomplish what you've committed. Reuben, Gad, and partial tribe of Manasseh consented. They would cross equipped, battle with their relatives, and come back only after seizure was finished. Moses made official the agreement before Eleazar, Joshua, and the group chiefs. The judgment generated a geographical division from the beginning. The people's unity would now bridge a waterway. The eastern groups occupied outside the territory itself, in domain not initially committed. Their selection formed precedent for dwelling beside, instead of inside, the committed portion. The manuscript reports this plainly, but consequences spread outward. The eastern occupation presented division into the group framework. Physical distance would ultimately produce cultural and spiritual separation. The Jordan River, intended to be traversed, transformed into a lasting boundary inside the people itself. Still, the agreement also showed adaptability. The seizure obtained more domain than originally outlined. Instead of forsaking quality territory, they absorbed it. The group framework modified to unforeseen achievement. Practicality encountered standard and settlement surfaced. The eastern groups maintained their commitment. They traversed Jordan equipped. They battled in seizure operations. They persisted until the territory was controlled. Only afterward did they come back to their households and animals east of the waterway. Joshua afterward released them with favor and recognizing their dedicated contribution, but inquiries persisted. Was their selection prudent? They gave priority to livestock over complete involvement in the territory of commitment. They appreciated quick economic benefit over total incorporation with their covenant assembly. They occupied where they positioned rather than where God initially outlined. The manuscript doesn't openly condemn them, neither does it completely approve them. The uncertainty mirrors actuality. Their judgment was comprehensible but potentially troublesome, sensible but hazardous, acceptable but not perfect. The Transjordan seizure itself achieved completely. Two realms collapsed. No alliance assembled against them. The triumphs arrived rapidly and conclusively. The emerging generation demonstrated capability. They could battle. They could succeed. They could claim domain. The occupation sequence, nevertheless, presented complexity. From the beginning, the 12 groups filled two separate areas. The Jordan River separated them geographically. That geographical separation would, with duration, appear as political, spiritual, and cultural distance. The contradiction is severe. The opening seizure generated the opening division. Triumph yielded difficulties. Achievement produced fresh troubles. They acquired domain but sacrificed unified occupation. They secured combats but compromised wholeness. The eastern groups constructed settlements. They formed themselves. They titled their locations and asserted the territory. Reuben reconstructed Heshbon, Elealeh, Kiriathaim, Nebo, and Baal-meon. Gad strengthened Dibon, Ataroth, Aroer, and additional ones. The partial group of Manasseh claimed Gilead and Bashan, their dwelling, but dwelling was east of commitment. They held portion, but portion was beyond the initially outlined territory. They connected to the people, but they resided past its natural limit. The uncertainty stays unaddressed at the manuscript's conclusion. The eastern groups function as complete participants of the assembly, still separated from it, completely dedicated to the seizure, still selecting to reside beyond the principal reward, dedicated in combat, still giving priority to livestock worth over total incorporation. The Transjordan seizure achieved militarily. It troubled things according to covenant. Both realities stay accurate: triumph and division, achievement and uncertainty, seizure and settlement. The emerging generation secured their opening combats. They also rendered their opening debatable judgment, and both actualities would influence everything that came after. The chart of suffering, retracing the desert stations. The manuscript abruptly offers a thorough route, a catalogue, station by station, from Egypt to the flatlands of Moab, 42 sites. A desert chart traced in location titles, each indicating where the people encamped during their extended wandering. Moses documented these phases at God's instruction. The catalogue starts, "They traveled from Ramesses in the opening month, on the 15th day of the opening month, the day following Passover. The people advanced out confidently in observation of all the Egyptians." The expedition's beginning radiates with success. Traveling, freedom, Egypt observing, unable to prevent them. The path traced liberty's opening movements. Then the titles proceed: Succoth, Etham, Pi-hahiroth, Migdol, through the waters, into the desert of Shur, Marah, Elim, Red Sea, Desert of Sin, each title a marker, each site a recollection. Some titles bear clear significance. Marah signifies bitter, the location where water was unfit until Moses rendered it pure. Elim signifies vegetation or palms, the refuge with 12 springs and 70 palm vegetation where they discovered comfort. The titles themselves convey compressed accounts. Additional titles stay unclear. Dophkah, Alush, Rephidim. We understand minimal about these stations beyond their arrangement in the order. The people encamped there. They continued on. The sites mattered sufficiently to document, but insufficiently to clarify. The catalogue incorporates locations of significant occurrences: Sinai, where the regulation was provided; Kibroth Hattava, burial sites of desire, where those who requested meat were interred; Hazeroth, where Miriam was afflicted with skin condition for opposing Moses. These titles secure the route to account, providing the geographical catalogue dramatic significance. But most titles surface only in this catalogue. No accounts connected to them, no occurrences are documented. They signify the extensive stretches of duration between emergencies, the extended undramatic years of postponing, the gradual advance toward death that depleted a generation. 42 stations total. 40 years of wandering. Some stations continued days. Additional ones may be years. The catalogue compresses duration unevenly. Particular eras burst with movement and precision. Additional ones disappear into quietness, indicated only by a location title and the expression "they traveled from and encamped at." The route fulfills various intentions. It builds geographical actuality. These weren't wandering without direction. They adhered to a path, particular sites, genuine landscape. The expedition had organization, even if its intention was consequence. The catalogue also operates as remembrance. Subsequent generations reading these titles would retain, each site signified portion of the shared account. The titles themselves transformed into ceremony. Recounting the stations indicated, reviewing the breakdown, the endurance, the gradual death, the ultimate arrival. Some researchers propose the catalogue fulfilled functional intentions. Subsequent travelers could adhere to the path. Pilgrims retracing the expedition would recognize the route. The geographical information safeguarded genuine history instead of legendary account. But the catalogue bears theological significance beyond geography. This is the chart of a generation's death. Every station indicates duration moving. Every title signifies days or years nearer to the instant when the final participant of the judged generation perished and the emerging generation could ultimately traverse Jordan. The titles gather around Sinai initially, indicating prolonged presence at the elevation. Then they distribute outward, signifying movement and emergency. Subsequent titles surface in the Transjordan area, indicating the approach to the committed territory. The route itself traces the arc from regulation through uprising to readiness for seizure. Reflect on what the catalog doesn't incorporate. No timeline except at opening and conclusion. No clarification of span at each location. No suggestion of why particular sites were selected. The titles exist independently, a framework of the expedition without substance of everyday encounter. Still, this framework quality matters. The catalog diminishes 40 years to location titles. It removes away the monotony, the routine, the countless regular days of desert living. What persists is organization, path, order, the essential framework of a national expedition from bondage through consequence to preparedness for portion. Each title signified someone's recollection. Children delivered at one station and maturing before the following relocation. Seniors perishing and being interred at sites whose titles indicated their burial places permanently. Households encountering everyday existence. Deliveries, deaths, unions, disputes, restorations, all compressed into a singular location title in the catalog. The route also emphasizes absences in the account. The manuscript conveys us nearly nothing about 38 years of the 40-year span. This catalog demonstrates they maintained moving, maintained encamping, maintained existing during that quietness. The stations demonstrate the people didn't suspend an account duration. Existence proceeded. They merely weren't accomplishing anything deserving documentation beyond persistence. Some titles surface nowhere else in sacred writings. They function only in this catalog. Rimon Perez, Libna, Risa, Kehelata, Mount Sheper, Harada, Machelot, Tahat. These sites joined history once, when the people encamped there and disappeared from recollection except for incorporation in this inventory. The catalog concludes at the flatlands of Moab, encamped by the Jordan across from Jericho. The concluding station. Expedition finished. The chart of suffering ends at the boundary of commitment. 42 stations. 1 generation deceased. 1 generation prepared. The desert behind. The waterway ahead. Reading the catalog transforms into a ceremony. Each title a marker on a meditation strand. Each site a tone in a lament. The stations express the account without conveying it. They indicate duration without clarifying it. They safeguard geography without analyzing it. But analysis surfaces from the organization itself. This is where they traveled. This is how extended it required. This is the route from servitude through desert to edge of commitment. The chart demonstrates the expedition occurred. The stations confirm the account. The titles secure recollection to genuine terrain. Subsequent generations would travel past some of these sites. They could inquire, why is this location titled Kibroth Hattaavah? The response would arrive. Because our forebears desired meat there and were interred in consequence. The geography itself transformed into instruction instrument. The terrain communicated. The chart of suffering doesn't celebrate the expedition. It records it. The stations exist as testimonies, neither judging nor pardoning, merely indicating where a people spent 40 years discovering that commitment postponed is not commitment refused, and that God's schedule seldom corresponds with human anticipation. On the flatlands of Moab, a generation arranged, a chief's departure. The people distributed across the flatlands of Moab, encamped along the Jordan from Beth Jeshimoth to Abel Shittim, Behind them existed the desert. Before them ran the waterway. Beyond the waterway climbed the elevations of Canaan. 40 years had moved since their parents declined to join. That generation rested in desert burial sites, their remains distributed across the path traced in the route. Only Joshua and Caleb persisted from the initial exodus. Everyone else was delivered or raised in the wasteland, offspring of the judged generation who received both commitment and caution. They had been examined. Flame from sky depleted rebels at Taberah. Foul and disease attacked at Kibroth Hattaavah. The ground consumed Korah's group. Bronze serpent rescued those bitten by poisonous snakes. Balaam favored them against his patron's desires. They collapsed to temptation at Baal of Peor, and 24,000 perished. The second counting tallied survivors. The daughters of Zelophehad obtained portion rights. They overcame Sihon and Og, asserting the Transjordan. They were no longer the people that departed Egypt. Desert training had molded them. Their parents' breakdown instructed them. They recognized the expense of disbelief. They had observed God's consequence and God's compassion frequently in the identical day. They grasped covenant-required dedication, not informal agreement. Moses assembled them repeatedly in these concluding weeks. He examined the regulation. He reminded them of records. He cautioned them of approaching temptations. The addresses that constitute Deuteronomy surfaced, merged from this instant. A prophet who cannot join, readying those who will. Moses himself positioned at the boundary of his own restriction, 120 years old, the manuscript reports. His vision persisted clear. His power hadn't reduced. Still, he would not traverse. Meribah's outcomes held secure. He struck the stone when God stated speak. He signified God's favor as his own furious supply. The mistake prohibited him from finishing. The sorrow is intense. Moses guided them out of Egypt. He mediated when God considered destroying them. He ascended Sinai to obtain regulation. He resolved disputes. He arranged the encampment. He tolerated their objections. He observed his sister and brother perish. He directed them through 40 years of aimless wandering, and now, with the territory invisible from the flatlands, he would transfer guidance to Joshua and stay behind. Still, the manuscript reports no objection. Moses approved the decree. He read Joshua publicly before the complete gathering. God directed him to authorize his replacement openly, transferring authority so the people would adhere when Moses was departed. The conveyance of guidance showed persistence and modification. Joshua had demonstrated himself. He investigated the territory and delivered back a dedicated report. He battled Amalek. He assisted Moses throughout the desert years. He held the characteristics required for seizure: bravery, belief, military ability, and divine favor. But Joshua wasn't Moses. He wouldn't communicate with God directly, face to face. He wouldn't execute signs like the Egyptian afflictions. He wouldn't facilitate regulation from the elevation. His function was particular. Guide the people across, distribute the territory, form them in the domain committed to their forebears. The people themselves had evolved. They positioned, prepared in a manner their parents never accomplished. The opening generation observed wonders and objected. This generation matured with manna and complaints, grasping both as regular. They existed recognizing their parents perished for faithlessness. The instruction burned profoundly. Their military achievement against the Amorite realms demonstrated their competence. They could battle. They could seize. They could hold domain. The inquiry wasn't capability. It was dedication. Would they rely on God sufficiently to endeavor what appeared unfeasible? Would they accept the commitment